Hey, welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic specifically, and whether or not the story that we've been told, including in movies from James Cameron, is maybe different than what might have actually happened. And is there a connection between the Federal Reserve and the Titanic? Back in 1912, the luxurious cruise ship, the Titanic, sunk mysteriously in the North Atlantic Ocean. And it was a massive tragedy at the time. And all of society, including up to the modern day that we live in, has kind of led to believe that this unfortunate accident was kind of random. Movies were made from it. And I'll admit that years ago when this movie came out, I saw it many times in the theater. And actually, am very familiar as a result with the storyline that we've been told. But what if that story isn't exactly true? And there's a connection between the owner of the Titanic, John J.P. Morgan, and the Federal Reserve System, as well as John Jacob Astor, who perished on the cruise ship, Nikola Tesla, and some insurance money. So there might be more to this sordid story than we led to believe. So we're going to break it down today. What exactly is the Federal Reserve System? It was created back in 1913 via the Federal Reserve Act. There's a board of directors that are appointed by the President of the United States. There's 12 regional banks spread out across the country. The Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, sets the monetary policy for the country. The Fed is the third central bank of the U.S. Prominent leaders opposed the creation of the Fed, and John Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim were among those who opposed. In 1907, after some severe speculation in the copper industry, there was a near collapse of the U.S. financial system. J.P. Morgan and some other prominent New York banks ended up personally bailing out the financial system, which created the perfect context and justification for introducing a new central bank, which functions as a lender of last resort. What does this have to do with the Titanic? Well, the next question is, was the sinking of the Titanic premeditated or even planned? Back in 1898, 14 years before the sinking of the Titanic, author Morgan Robertson wrote a book called Wreck of the Titan, which has eerily similar storyline to that of the actual Titanic sinking events. A ship in foggy conditions in the night strikes a giant iceberg and sinks almost immediately. A group of very privileged passengers are aboard. There aren't enough lifeboats or life jackets to save everyone, and most of the passengers perish. Is this a coincidence? Was this someone who had a premonition, or was this a planned and orchestrated event that was documented ahead of time? One of the opponents of the Federal Reserve System was wealthy real estate magnate John Jacob Astor IV. Very wealthy guy, rumored to have owned 40% of all real estate at the time. He perished in the Titanic crash, and his pregnant wife actually survived. His body was recovered and he was later buried in Manhattan, and the majority of his fortune was left to his son, Vincent. John Astor was from the New York area. His family had money. They made it in fur trading and real estate prior to his birth. He was well educated at St. Paul's prep school as well as Harvard, and joined the military for a few years in the late 1890s and built the Astoria Hotel, which became the Waldorf Astoria eventually. John Astor wrote a book in 1894 that was a science fiction novel about life in the year 2000 on the planets Saturn and Jupiter. And this novel, titled A Journey into Other Worlds, included descriptions of a worldwide telephone network, solar power, air travel, space travel to the planets Saturn and Jupiter, as well as terraforming engineering products. All of these concepts were extremely futuristic for the late 1800s. Astor also held several patents, including a bicycle brake, a vibratory disintegrator used to produce gas from peat moss, and a pneumatic road improver, and he helped develop a turbine engine. Astor was invested in the inventions and technology of Nikola Tesla, who was a pioneer in wireless technology as well as energy, light, and propulsion systems. Rival J.P. Morgan was also an investor in Tesla's project. The connection between Astor and J.P. Morgan is an interesting one via Nikola Tesla. Tesla began his career in Europe, born in Croatia, worked in London and Belgrade. His primary interest was alternating current. He moved to the United States in 1892 and had a tremendous number of challenges in his career, from being swindled and failed deals and ended up broke on several occasions. In 1895, Tesla's lab burned. He lost all of his plans, notes, and models, and told a reporter that he was devastated. In 1901, Tesla signed a deal with JP Morgan where he signed over 51% of the interest in his patents and inventions, including all future inventions relating to electric, lighting, wireless telephony, for only $150K. One failed but pivotal project for Tesla was the Wardenclyffe site, also invested in by JP Morgan, and unfortunately JP Morgan's stalled funding led the project to fail, and it gave a rival an advantage. In addition to being rivals regarding the work of Nikola Tesla, it's also speculated that John Astor opposed the creation of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve System was going to give a tremendous amount of power to the centralized authority that wasn't necessarily in the best interest of citizens. Now, what's interesting is that JP Morgan owned the Titanic and invited quite a few of his rich friends to join the maiden voyage from the UK over to the US. However, JP Morgan canceled at the last minute. Why?
Over 50, mostly first-class passengers, cancelled their passages on the Titanic at the last minute. Many of them close friends and business associates of JP Morgan. Morgan himself cancelled his passage at the 11th hour, despite having the best suite on the ship, claiming illness. 2 days after the sinking, an American reporter found him in perfect health at the French resort of Aix-les-Bains.
Another interesting detail in this story is that JP Morgan and White Star actually owned two different ships, the Olympic and the Titanic. There was actually rumored to be a third one that was going to be built later on. However, the Titanic and the Olympic were nearly identical, a few minor differences physically between them. The Olympic ship had actually been in some collisions. A collision that was actually quite expensive, was not covered by insurance because the Olympic was at fault, and therefore the value and utility of the Olympic was damaged as a result. It was speculated that it wasn't even safe to make a voyage. The rumor is that the ships were swapped and that the Titanic actually wasn't the Titanic, or the ship that we believe took that fateful trip was actually the Olympic, and they were swapped at the last minute. And therefore, the damage that was caused by the wreck with the Olympic previously made the ship vulnerable to sinking. Now, the rumor further goes that JP Morgan was concerned that as World War I was looming, the British military had the right to commandeer the vessels that JP Morgan owned, because he was not a UK citizen, and use them for wartime efforts. So a couple of birds were killed with one stone in this particular incident. The damaged ship, the Olympic, was now going to be removed from the fleet, and an insurance payment would be collected. The risk of commandeering from the British Navy was going to be removed, and his rivals to the creation of the Federal Reserve System, which were John Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim, among others, would be removed as threats for the implementation of the third iteration of the U.S. Central Bank.
Titanic cost $10 million to build, and as a brand new ship would have been insurable for that amount and more. The Olympic, on the other hand, damaged beyond economic repair, would only have been insurable for a much smaller amount. A motive for switching the ships is clear. Normally, White Star Line, when they insured their ships, took on part of the risk themselves, and it was at first thought that Lloyd's of London would only be liable for $7.5 million. Not so. For just 1 week before the maiden voyage of the Titanic, which we now know was in fact the Olympic, White Star Line upped their insurance on the vessel dramatically. And, incredibly, just 5 days after the sinking, Lloyd's paid out $12.5 million.
If the sinking of the Titanic was an intentional or planned effort, that means that the crew was in on it, including Captain Edward Smith. The theory or speculation goes that he was told to sink the ship, however, was also told that the Californian would be parked nearby awaiting his alert or distress signal and would come and rescue everyone. This is why it's speculated that the efforts to flee the ship were kind of taken very slowly and haphazardly, because there was this assumption on the part of the crew that the Californian would come and get them. Now the question remains, why did the Californian not come? Is it that the effort was canceled so that the people on the ship would perish to potentially stop the blocking of the Federal Reserve System? Or was there some other motive that we haven't yet figured out?
What if I told you the Titanic never sank?
What?
So the owner of the boat, JP Morgan, actually had two boats. He had the Titanic and he had the Olympic. And the Olympic was a little bit older and a little bit more run down, and it was also in some accidents.
Okay.
So the theory is that JP Morgan sank the boat on purpose because he knew he would get a lot of money.
What?
He did it for the insurance money, right? But why sink the newly built Titanic when you could scratch off the paint, swap the names, and sink the Olympic instead?
He just painted the word Titanic over the Olympic?
It gets worse. Guess who was on that boat?
Who? I know there's a lot of people on the boat.
All of JP Morgan's business competitors.
What?
And not one of them made it out.
Oh my god.
But guess who wasn't on the boat?
Who?
JP Morgan.
Was he supposed to be?
He canceled minutes before it left.
Because he knew it was gonna sink.
And there was a guy named James Fenton, right, who survived and worked on the boat. And on his deathbed, his last words were, "The Titanic never sank. It was the Olympic."
Wait, what?
And he said that if he said anything, something bad would happen to him.
So what you're trying to say is the movie Titanic's actually called the Olympic.
Exactly.
Like the sinking of the Titanic, which was financed by JP Morgan, who was supposed to be on the ship when it sunk, but he, out of nowhere, just a couple hours before it set sail, canceled his plans. But guess who did? 3 of his major competitors who were opposed to a national bank. And I guess it's also just a coincidence that JP Morgan caused the panic of 1907, where he shorted the market. And in 1910 was the meeting on Jekyll Island that no one's supposed to know about. It's also just a coincidence that just weeks after JP Morgan wrote a letter to his friend asking if a civilian freightliner being sunk by a German U-boat would pull us into World War I, that the Lusitania sank.
It's been over 100 years since the Titanic sunk, so it's going to be very difficult to know for sure what happened, what people's motivations were. But I do find it interesting that there's a lot of sordid connections between the founding of the Federal Reserve System and some tragedies like the sinking of the Titanic. It does lead further credence to the fact that the institutional financial world has had really strong motivations to control how the money system works, how money is created, and who exactly sits in those positions of authority. Moving to the sort of modern time that we live in, it's also very unclear who exactly owns the Fed. We know it is a private entity. There's 12 regional banks. There are shareholders in the Fed. We kind of understand who the shareholders are of the regional banks, but sometimes the paper trail gets a little bit muddy. And there may be many, many international owners of the Fed who in essence control our money system, who may not have the best interests of the United States at heart. So as we continue to pursue this rabbit hole of the future of money, it's helpful to look back in the past and explore interesting events like the sinking of the Titanic. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.